I think we cooked because this actually looks so good. About 2 to 3 weeks ago, I finished this lovely, lovely mute top, and it was mostly smooth sailing. The pattern was first published in July of 2025, so last summer, and it has since blown up. I think it has around 2,300 sales on Ravelry and even more queued up, and I'm just a little jealous. But it was a really great pattern to actually follow. It was one of her first patterns as a knit designer and one of my first patterns stepping into the knit world. I have only made one vest in the past, so this is my first actual top, and it was very beginner friendly. I didn't really have any issues in terms of techniques or actually following the pattern. Where the problems arose, aside from my own inability to read patterns, I have found that there were a lot of comments on sizing. I am normally a medium, but based on the pattern measurements, it looks like I'm going to be sizing up, which makes me a little nervous. I was a little worried about how the upper portion or the bust increase portion would look because I was thinking the small might be too small, the medium might be like too baggy. If this can't get over my body, then the rest of the top will not. This is fitting like a glove. I only stepped into the knitting world maybe a month or two ago, and as far as I can tell, I think it's pretty common to have to frog for sizing issues, but there are a few common trends that I have found on Ravelry, on Instagram that some people have struggled with that I want to kind of comment on, and maybe if this is your next pattern, help you figure out some modifications that will get you the fit that you're actually looking for. Someone roast me in the comments if I am giving away too much information about this pattern, but this is just things that you can gather based on pictures and information that's already publicly available. So as far as the construction of this top goes, it is a bottom-up piece that starts with 2x2 ribbing, and then you get to the body piece, and then you make your armholes and your sleeving and all that jazz. It is a cinched waist, and the recommendation that Una Gil, or Una, I'm just gonna call it Una, gives is to have a wool or a wool blend yarn when you're working on this, just because it tends to hold its shape better. Caveat is superwash merino wool. I don't know the exact science when it comes to superwash merino wool, but it's processed in a way that when you go to block it, it actually expands in size. I've had this happen in many of my crochet pieces, so I'm very careful with how I block anything I make with superwash merino wool. Even a 75% merino wool will have this kind of effect, even if it's mixed with nylon, which will help keep its shape a little bit. But generally, a standard wool blend, a standard wool or a wool and nylon blend will be your best bet in terms of holding shape. As far as fixing the issues post finishing the project, my project actually expanded a little bit after I wore it once to my outing, and I used a tapestry needle and just sewed in an elastic cord into the waistband, and it fits like a glove again. I also ended up only using like one of this plus a little. The exact math is 113 grams of the Unicorn Superwash Merino wool, which is considered a fine yarn. So it was very, very little compared to what I was generally expecting for tops and sweaters. In total, this was 452 yards for a small size top. I forgot to mention this earlier, but if you are anywhere near my body measurements, I'm going to put them up here. I made a size small, and I will put any notes I have about the stitch counts, the rows that I took over the course of the project on the details below, and on my Ravelry where I will have everything posted. I want to preface that some of the issues that I had with the sizing, I would say, are actually pretty easily fixable compared to what I might have seen online, because I am a pretty average size person, average size torso, average size shoulders, a little smaller size bust, which actually makes sizing a little easier to account for because there's not a lot of this way that I need to account for. Sizing experience is going to be different for everyone because obviously everyone has different proportions, especially someone with maybe a larger chest, or if they're trying to get a specific look, there's going to be some modifications that you have to do while you're going throughout the pattern. That being said, these are the main issues that I had, and especially some of the most common issues that I saw across the board. One being the arm size. So you can kind of tell that the sleeve is pretty tight to my shoulder and armpit width. And that's I find that the size given in the pattern is a little small than what I would be comfortable with. When you are going through the pattern, my simple recommendation is to, regardless of what the pattern might say, take the diameter or take the circumference and figure out the diameter from your shoulder to armpit. And if you're a little like me and you don't like the bottom of your body panel to be right up against your armpit, give yourself at least an extra 1.5 or 2 inches to your arm sleeve so you have a little bit more wiggle room, a little more lax. You definitely don't want to give too much because it's not an oversized sleeve situation going on, but I find that it would be a little more comfortable. My sleeve actually ended up being around 6 inches, which I found was fine. I would optimally, ideally, the magic number would be 7 inches if I wanted to go back and actually increase this, but that's just something to look out for when you are working on the sleeve portion. If you're anything like me, you probably also didn't make a gauge swatch. I'm the type of person that when I'm making anything, I kind of just hold them up to my body and adjust based off of that. I was a little lucky on this one because by the time I got up to this much of ribbing and I actually had to frog back down to the beginning, I figured out the adjustments I had to make. And with that, my recommendation, because this is a cinched top that has a negative ease, especially for the ribbing portion, I am normally a medium size, but I actually made a size small, which fit me perfectly. So I just kind of went with the small because the ease with the measurements for the bust portion was matching with what I wanted. So it's looking pretty good so far. I'm actually really happy. Like, this is how much room we're working with. This especially applies if you're someone who knits a little tight, which I think is generally kind of pretty common, or wool, which does actually have stretch but elasticity to come back down. Even if it doesn't look like it fit you, it probably will if you're just something just under the size that you normally would wear. As far as the portion on top, as I said, I am normally a medium, but I end up making a size small because I like the more fitted look as opposed to the slouchy look. But she mentioned this in their pattern. You can add more slouch if that's the kind of look you're going for. It's very easy and customizable to change it based on what you're looking for in this top. If you look through Ravelry, there's actually a ton of different, slouchiness lengths that people are showing on their pictures. So go through them, take a look at which one you're vibing with. I actually took at least an hour, maybe two, just staring at the pictures because I could not figure out the kind of fit that I wanted. And I think if you have a top even remotely similar to the Mew top in your closet, that could be a good starting point. These are some of the tops that I actually really liked, but ultimately landed on the more fitted look. Something that isn't quite talked about that I would have personally liked to see in the pattern is the boat neckline. As you can kind of see, the neckline is created to make a off-the-shoulder silhouette. Personally, I would have pushed for the shaping so that it creates a more relaxed almost silhouette that when you are off the shoulder here, it isn't stretching the seams and the sides over here. You can do this by adding a few more increases when you're either creating the bust or alternatively when you are working on the shoulder panel so you have a wider neckline. Obviously, this is entirely up to her. The neckline is already quite wide, so I can imagine quite a few ways to make the neckline wider without having to do a ton of modifications, but just a point in the silhouette that you can customize when you are going through the armhole and the neckline portion of the pattern. As far as general advice goes when I was making this pattern, my top recommendation is getting a cord connector. A cord connector is basically this little piece of metal tube that you can connect to your interchangeable wires so that when you are working on, let's say, the ribbing and you want to try it on, the cord is probably too small to actually let you put on the top because the cord that I was using when I was making the ribby portion was probably only like 24 inches, and I can tell you that my waist is definitely not 24. So getting a cord connector so you can connect two cables is actually a godsend when you are working on something that's in the round and your piece is kind of connected, but you need to try it on so you can see if the sizing is correct. So highly recommend getting one of these little very simple tubes. I got my lifeline in. If I lose this thing, I will just sit in the corner and cry. I can't try it on with the cable on because my cable is only like, I don't know, 24 inches and I am not 24 inches. So apparently there's a thing that you can do called, you can thread all your stitches onto something called a lifeline or like a scrap piece of yarn, and then use that to hold all your stitches while you try it on. My next piece would be to start using the twisted pearls when you are doing a ribbing. Maybe it's just me. My tension when I am doing a 2x2 rib is not great. I would give myself like a B minus. Purling does use more yarn, and you have to really focus on making sure that when you are purling, you're tightening up your stitches so it is not as loose when compared to the knit side. My alternative to having to tie in every single purl stitch was to do a twisted purl stitch, which ultimately uses less yarn and is more even across the board for a 2x2 ribbing. And I found this so helpful towards making my finished piece look a little more complete. Something about the purl architecture? Basically the pathway, it uses less yarn, so it looks a little less lumpy. It doesn't look exactly like a purl stitch, but it is so close that no one, even myself, if I was looking at this like a month down the line, I probably wouldn't have even remembered I actually used twisted purl stitches. When it comes to binding off the pattern, I have always found in the past that my bind off was actually pretty tight, and I know that for something that you want off the shoulder to be a more relaxed look, you want it to be not tight so it can actually, you know, do its thing, move around. And I found that a lot of people were recommending something called Jenny's super elastic bind off method, and it's really easy to follow. I will link the video that I used down below, but it was super helpful, and this is definitely the kind of elasticity that I needed for a top like this. Some other people have used an I-cord, so that is another option, as well as it will help you control the amount of rolling that your top might do. Finally, the seaming. I used the mattress stitch on the shoulder seams to put the front and back piece together, which I thought was the cleanest look and didn't have to do a lot of fiddling around. Just make sure that your edges when you are decreasing for the left and right side are clean, so when you are picking up the stitches to the mattress stitch, it looks very seamless. Not all of mine were the cleanest, but I made it work. We're calling it there. The last thing that I would advise, and this has nothing to do with the pattern itself, but is to just, when you are knitting, making sure that your yarn is always on the right side. This might sound obvious, and I don't mean yarn on the right side as whether you hold it with your left or right hand. I mean that the yarn is attached to your project on the right needle. I have put down and picked up my project way too many times, and after knitting clockwise, for whatever reason, I would pick up the yarn and switch the needles, and I would end up with something called a short row, which is what happens when you go counterclockwise and then you start knitting clockwise, or whatever direction it is. You know, some people can use a stitch marker on the right needle to indicate which side the yarn is supposed to be on when you're picking back up, so that's a really good reminder that I probably could have used when I was just starting off the rounds on this top. So all in all, that's all I really had to say about the Mew top. I generally love the pattern. It was super easy to make, and I highly recommend it, especially as a beginner. It's a very easy top to make. It's not a made to measure pattern, but after you get the initial bottom portion, I would just kind of do it on a vibe basis. See if the ribbing, the length is what you're looking for, if it's you want a crop size or you want a more lengthy size. The bust, you know, how loose do you want it to be, how tight do you want it to be. It's easy to not count the rows and just go with the flow. If I want a crop look, tuck in a little bit, and no one can really see the difference as far as the bottom banding goes. The only time you need to count the rows is when you're matching the back and the front size, so you're actually making the equal size pieces on the both ends, but generally you can customize it pretty easily. As far as material goes, like I said, if you're not using wool, you can use cotton, you can use these other materials. I would just also recommend using elasticity so you keep the shape throughout the life of the top. Otherwise, you might end up with something super baggy. With that, I hope that you are a little more confident with making the Mew top if this is your next project. But yeah, happy knitting!